The college football playoff bracket is set in this first year of the 12-team format, and it includes just 3 SEC teams after an upset in the ACC championship game. Means Alabama, with its 3 losses, are on the outside looking in. A little bit of controversy. Big surprise there, right? Maybe the only expected thing that's come true this season. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer with you as always. This week, pinch hitting for John Adams, who's on vacation this week. We have Chase Goodbread, columnist at the Tuscaloosa News, does a great job covering Alabama and the SEC. We wanted to bring him in today with Alabama being left out of the field, a few other SEC teams in. Chase knows Alabama's program as well as anyone. He's also spent many years with his eye on the SEC as well. So, Chase, let's start the conversation with, I guess, what was maybe the most dramatic moment of the bracket show Sunday on ESPN. I don't know if it was the most consequential moment. I think you could argue some of the seeding will be more consequential than the last team in or out. But the big suspense moment would be who would be the last team in. It ultimately came down to either SMU or Alabama. I thought both teams had a pretty flawed case. This is the reality of a 12-team format, right? The resumes are going to look a little bit different than we're used to. But what was your reaction seeing SMU's name pop up? A, did that surprise you? And B, do you think committee got it right?
I can't say I was shocked. I kind of teetered back and forth a little bit during the week on what the committee might do. Ultimately, all season long, I said I'd be surprised if the committee put in a 3-loss at-large team. And that's what it was ultimately faced with Alabama. Obviously, Clemson was a 3-loss team, but they were a conference champion. I'm talking about at-large here. So from that standpoint, I'm not surprised. They never let a 2-loss team in the 4-team playoff in 10 years of it. 40 invitations. Never happened. I do think we're going to see a 3-loss at-large team over time. I certainly do. But I was kind of back and forth on what they might do during the week. I thought the best case for Alabama, or at least what sounded like the best case for Alabama, was Ward Manuel's comments this past Tuesday, right? After the end of the regular season. He mentioned that if you weren't in a conference championship game, you were kind of locked in. He was asked directly, is it possible that SMU could lose and fall behind Alabama? He said potentially, which sounded like you're darn right it could happen to me. I mean, to me, that came off as something SMU didn't want to hear, not something Alabama didn't want to hear. So I thought after Tuesday, and look, why did Miami fall out of the picture? Pretty much the same reason Alabama fans were arguing they should be in front of SMU. So throw that into the mix, right? So, with the way Miami got treated there at the end and with the way Manuel's comments came off, I kind of felt like Alabama was probably going to get in there based on that. Wasn't quite so sure a little bit later in the week. Like I said, I kind of teetered. And then when SMU lost a close one, you kind of knew it was up in the air. The committee is going to be just as loath to exclude a conference championship game loser that's otherwise qualified as they might a 3-loss team. They end up taking SMU. I wasn't shocked, but I did think 5 days earlier Alabama was looking pretty good.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned that this committee showed that it was low to reject a conference runner-up or even really penalize much a conference runner-up that was in the field before. I mean, we saw that with Texas. They were positioned for the 2 seed before they lose the SEC championship game. They lose, and so they can't get a first-round bye by a rule, but they fell no further than that 5 seed, the top seed available to them. Then you had Penn State lose the Big Ten championship game, and they fell to the 6th seed. So in this first year of the 12-team format, one of my big takeaways was and I guess I said this a little bit with my tongue in my cheek, but not too much. Like, there's never been a better time to lose your conference championship game. In the 4-team playoff, in the BCS era, you got no prize for losing your conference championship game. I mean, we did see the one year in the SEC where both Georgia and Alabama got in after they faced off in the SEC championship game. But, really in the 4-team playoff era, if you lost your conference championship game, you could expect to be on the outside looking in of the playoff format. Now, in this first year of the new format, that was one of the things we learned, is that if you are your conference runner-up and you were in the field before your conference championship game, the committee is going to take some steps to protect you, at least with this committee. The interesting thing for me, Chase, was, so after SMU was so close to completing that comeback against Clemson, I thought Saturday night, I'm like, I'm not for sure, because when in doubt over the years, I feel like the committee has leaned Bama, but that game was close. SMU had to come back. I feel like, the narrative was on their side a little bit. I thought, I think they're going to go with SMU. But then when I saw Clemson pop up on the bracket on the 12 line, I thought, oh, they're not going to rank SMU ahead of Clemson, right? Clemson just beat them. I thought Alabama's in, SMU's not. So at that point, I became surprised to see that SMU was in and Alabama was out, just because we'd seen that Clemson was the 12th seed, and I didn't think I still don't understand why SMU is seated above Clemson, other than just going off pure record, since Clemson beat them 12 hours before the bracket.
There's going to be some tweaking to this format over time, isn't there? Maybe quickly. What about the Boise State and Arizona State getting in there with buys when they're clearly not, to me anyway, one of the best 4 teams in the country, or 2 of the best 4 teams in the country? I think that's something to look at too.
I wonder, Chase, as we look at this last team in debate, and I don't know how you feel, but I think so much oxygen, and we're doing it here, and ink is spilled on this, and when in reality, whoever that last team in was going to be an underdog in the first round anyway, sure. Right? I mean, but this is the way these formats work. We see it in the NCAA tournament every year. But I wonder, do you feel like among the teams left out, Alabama had the best case, or do you look at somebody else inside the SEC or otherwise as maybe being the biggest snub? Because as I see this, for me, I didn't really think the debate had to come down to Alabama or SMU. I mean, to me, there were other better candidates out there. Ole Miss had the same record as Alabama, but in terms of impressive victories, it pummeled Georgia, which won the SEC championship game, and it pummeled South Carolina, another team in the mix. Had some bad losses in terms of the caliber of opponents, certainly with
UK
Kentucky.
Was a bad loss.
Kentucky was a bad one, but didn't get blown out, unlike Alabama getting blown out against Oklahoma. So I thought a case could be made for Ole Miss. And I thought, going the other direction, if the committee just doesn't want to select a 3-loss team, I don't necessarily share that rationale, but I can at least appreciate it. But I thought, if the committee doesn't want to select a 3-loss team, why does it have to be SMU? Why not BYU, another 2-loss team that beat SMU in SMU's stadium this season? I get that BYU wasn't in the conference championship game, but when you look at resumes, BYU's got the better resume and beat SMU head-to-head. And the other thing I thought about, if we're just throwing strength of schedule out the window, because SMU doesn't have a very good strength of schedule, doesn't have really any marquee victories, well, then why aren't we talking about Army, which actually did win its conference championship game? Look, I know they got blown out by Notre Dame, but SMU didn't play anybody of Notre Dame's caliber all season and lost its conference championship game. So for me, I didn't think the conversation had to even come down to SMU or Alabama. I would have gone in another direction. I probably would have gone with Ole Miss because of those impressive dominant victories, including against Georgia. Did you feel like someone else maybe was near the top of the list of the conversation of quote unquote getting snubbed?
I think strength of schedule ought to be integral to the process. And if strength of schedule is going to be integral to the process, then I would say Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina, all 3 are at the front of the door knocking here from the outside, are they not? Now, and I understand, there are other factors involved. There are there are losses that are bad. There are losses that are not so bad. Overall record ought to play a role, but strength of schedule's got to play in there too. I think it's paramount that strength of schedule be a big part of how this committee looks at this thing. And obviously their evaluation of Alabama versus SMU certainly didn't weigh as much as Manuel tried to say it did. But broader than that, like you said, broader than just Alabama, SMU, I think it boils down to that. If you're not going to make strength of schedule the number one factor you look at after conference championships and overall record, then what is?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was interesting. We knew there would be squabbling no matter how this came out, but as expected, or at least expected for me. I mean, we heard from Greg Byrne, Alabama's athletic director, in the form of a long statement, I guess, on X after the selection, basically saying that because of this result and because strength of schedule was not valued more, that Alabama would have to closely evaluate its non-conference scheduling in the future and take a look at some games that are already on the docket in future seasons. Now, at first glance, that comment I thought presented pretty strangely, because Alabama was not left out because of anything that happened in the non-conference play. It was left out because it lost 3 SEC games. And frankly, the reason why Alabama was in the conversation was because of its strength of schedule. Now, that ultimately wasn't enough to get it across the finish line, but that's why Alabama was in the conversation with 3 losses, was because of the strength of schedule. So taking measures to negatively impact your strength of schedule on the surface doesn't make a lot of sense. The counter argument would be to holistically reduce your risk of losing throughout the season by replacing some marquee non-conference opponents with easier non-conference opponents. Now, I actually think that this is kind of much ado about nothing, because I don't think any drastic measures need to be taken by any individual SEC programs in response to the committee's decision here. I mean, Alabama is 1 win against Vanderbilt away from being in the playoff. Ole Miss is a win against Florida, where it went 0 for 3 in red zone attempts away from being in the playoff, right? And I know there are a number of teams saying shoulda, woulda, coulda, but I do feel like, do you really need to blow up your entire scheduling philosophy when every season we know is a little bit different? The committee is not the Supreme Court. Like, there's no legal precedent here that just because they decided one way one year means that a future committee will decide in the same way. So I'm wondering what you thought about what Byrne said after the selection, and whether you think this is just bluster, or do you think Alabama actually will water down its non-conference scheduling in the future?
Couple thoughts on that. Number one, absent the college football playoff selection committee's decisions here in the last week, Alabama's future non-conference games, and they've got Ohio State coming up on the docket down the road, Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, Boston College, Florida State. They've loaded it up with a lot of Power Fours. Those games, in my opinion, were already on the chopping block to some extent, because when the SEC goes to a 9-game conference schedule in 2026, which I think is going to happen, those games were probably not all of them, but I would expect some of those games to go by the wayside anyway. So start with that, and if it comes to pass in a couple of years, the logic was already in place to get rid of those games before, at least from Byrne's perspective, to get rid of at least some of those games before the CFP's decision. As far as what Byrne's comments were, as far as reducing the toughness of the non-conference schedule, and he caught a lot of grief because people were saying, well, wait a minute, Alabama didn't play anybody in the non-conference schedule. To me, that's totally beside the point. When the committee looks at CFP top 25 wins, they don't care if it's in conference or out of conference. when ESPN does its strength of schedule rankings, that throws everybody in there, non-conference, conference, all of it. And so to me, there's there are no hairs to split here between conference and non-conference. Byrne's point was pretty simple and a fair one, I thought. SMU had a lot less resistance, be it conference or non-conference, along its path to qualification than Alabama did. And to Byrne's point, if SMU is going to be able to get in the back door with the schedule SMU played overall, I'm not just talking out of conference, then what's the point of tackling Notre Dame and Ohio State when the SEC schedule is going to be tough enough? I see that point.
Yeah, my biggest gripe with this whole selection thing, and I really think, like, if I'm awarding a grade, I give like a, I don't know, B- to this committee. I mean, it wasn't an abomination of a bracket. Some of these are controversial decisions. There's no magic answer to some of these questions. But I think my biggest gripe would be, like, and I touched on this earlier, the valuation, the heightened valuation of conference runners-up when these conferences have gotten so big that your conference schedule, only includes half the teams in your league. SMU is in a 17-team conference and played 8 regular season conference games. It avoided, during the regular season, the other 3 teams in the CFP top 25, being Clemson, Miami, and Syracuse. So it got to the conference championship game having to face none of those teams because it's in a massive league that plays just 8 conference games. So for me, that was my biggest gripe with the committee, was not necessarily SMU over Alabama or whatever, because all these teams are flawed. I'm not dying on that hill. It was just like, why do we have such protection? It's not written into the rules, but by the way the committee acted, they provided a lot of protection to conference runners-up, whether that be SMU in terms of getting a bid, or in the case of Texas and Penn State in terms of seeding. A lot of valuation for conference runners-up when you're only playing half the teams in your conference because the conferences have gotten so big. And so being the runner-up of your league, to a certain extent, comes down to luck of the draw in terms of scheduling. So that was more than anything, all this talk about scheduling, everything else. Why are we valuing conference runners up so much? I get valuing conference champions. They should be in the field, conference champions of a Power 4 league. You don't win your conference championship, all bets are off. You should get no protection.
Yeah, a couple thoughts there. Along with SMU and the teams they missed on their schedule in conference play, go look at Texas's conference schedule.
Bingo.
They missed, right? They took on, look, they caught Georgia and got beat by 2 touchdowns in the regular season. Who did Texas beat in the SEC? They beat Texas A&M. And I thought A&M was actually going to beat Texas at Kyle Field at the end of the season. They couldn't get anything going offensively, and Texas was able to pull that one out. But yeah, for Texas to make the run it did, and its best SEC win was a Texas A&M team that I guess ended up losing 4 games. That you can make the same point about Texas, right? And I think, to your point about conference runners up, I wrote a column roughly a week ago advocating for the end of conference championship games. I think they're just an appendix now, really. You don't need them. I don't think they're necessary. I think 17 games is too many games for 19-year-old kids. But beyond that, setting that aside, I think I don't think those conference championship games just bring much to the playoff table in a 12-team format. In a 4-team format, I think they did. I think they provided some good clarity in the 4-team format. In the 12-team format, I think that the regular season is much more capable of arbitrating between the 12th and 13th best team in the country than it was the 4th and the 5th, right? So they're money makers, and because they're money makers, they're here to stay. So I would not in a million years predict they're going to come to an end, but I think they should. Look, there was nothing wrong, in my opinion, pre-1992. I'm old enough, Blake, to remember pre-1992, unfortunately. Okay.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that before Roy Kramer invented conference championship games in 1992, there wasn't any clamor for them. Well, I'll tell you what there was a clamor for. And Greg Sankey actually made note of this, I think, with Feinbaum on television a few hours before the SEC championship game. But I don't agree with what he said, but there was a lot of clamor for people who wanted the national championship to be decided on the field, get the polls out of it when it comes to the national championship. I get it. If you were that 98% of all college football fans were like, yes, absolutely. Let's have a championship game instead of a bunch of writers like me and you voting for it. No, this is the champion. I get that. There was no clamor for conference championship games, none whatsoever. The champion was decided essentially with the same tiebreaker scheme that is used now to determine who gets into the conference championship games, right? Starts with conference record, then it goes head to head, then it goes who'd you beat, on and on and on. That's how you decided who the conference championship or who the conference champion was pre-1992, and it was fine. Nobody had a problem with it that I recall, and it wouldn't bug me a bit if they went back to that. You do that. I'm getting off on a soapbox here now. I'll back off of it. But if you do that, you cut a weekend out in December. You're gonna have another week to play with schedule wise, more rest. It goes on and on. Fans save a little money because now the fans, if they want to travel, they gotta come out of pocket like crazy now to follow a playoff. Fewer injuries. It just goes on and on. Get rid of them. I'm done.
Well, you can find that column from Chase over at TuscaloosaNews.com. Chase, I read that. I agreed with most of it. And I don't maybe feel as passionately as you do about getting rid of conference championships, but I also feel very little passion about protecting them either. And I covered the SEC championship game this weekend. I've covered it for a handful of years in a row now. I know you've covered several as well. And despite Georgia being one of the two teams, games in their backyard, there were thousands of empty seats in the upper deck. I don't care what they announced the crowd as. I know what my eyes saw. And I saw even for the mighty SEC championship game, had plenty of empty chairbacks. And the scene was even more magnified at different stadiums across the country. Now, one counter argument to that would be, okay, keep having the conference championships, but play them on the campus site of whoever you determine the number one seeded team is. Maybe you fill the stadium that way, or to your point, just do away with it entirely. The alternative take I would offer, and maybe you're looking out for the health of the 19 and 20-year-olds more than I am. I'm fine getting rid of the conference championship games, but give me another data point. Let's just play one more regular season game. This whole debate of like, oh, did Alabama or Ole Miss deserve the bid? Well, who knows? Maybe if we had a ninth SEC game, maybe if the season was 13 regular season games, rather than 12, that's another data point of these teams playing each other. Get a little more information about who deserves to be in, who deserves to be out. I get that the health perspective. I get that these guys are still students. They do have, other commitments as well. But I don't know. My feelings maybe have changed a little bit now in the day of NIL and the days of revenue sharing around the corner for athletes. They're pretty much professionals at this point. So I say, sure, scrap the conference championship games and let's just put another game on the regular season docket.
Another factor in all this, I think too, that's worth touching on is what happens one day soon when you got three teams in a conference that are good to go for the playoff. One of them loses the conference championship game, and the committee faces a decision. Okay, do we take the third place team that's unequivocally qualified without going to the championship game at all and bounce the team that lost it?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to see that ever or not?
I think we should consider it because so much of whether you make the conference championship game is based on your schedule draw, right? You look at the Big 12 championship game. the two teams in that were decided in part by a tiebreaker.
Right.
I don't know that Iowa State was actually the number 2 team in that league.
I'm looking forward to that uproar. That uproar is going to be massive.
When you take the number 3 team and leave out the runner up, I don't think. I'm good with it. I think the silver medalist of a league deserves no special protection. You win the gold, you're in the playoff if you're from a Power 4 league. I'm cool with it. Silver medalist, bronze medalist, it's all the same to me.
You want to hear the outcry to get rid of conference championship games get louder? Just wait till that happens.
I'm here for it. All right, let's broaden the scope here, Chase, and look at this bracket as it pertains to the SEC. So 3 teams are in a bracket. Georgia's got the bye, and as we record this, we do not know the status of Carson Beck. We know he suffered an elbow injury in that SEC championship game. Being in the building didn't look good. You saw it on TV. Sure, it didn't look good to you either. We don't have the official diagnosis yet, but not a great development for Georgia. But they do have the bye at least. They have a capable backup in Gunnar Stockton. They're the 2 seed. Texas is the 5 seed. They have a really, really nice path to go on a bit of a run here. They open against 12 seed Clemson, the only 3-loss team in the field, and then they would feed into a quarterfinal with Arizona State. And then the 3rd team from the SEC is 9th seeded Tennessee, which I think is good enough. I sort of draw the line after the 9 seed of teams that I think could win the whole thing. I don't see anybody 10 and below that I think could win the national championship. I think Tennessee's maybe good enough to be a long shot national title contender. What I don't like for them is their path. Tennessee's much better team at home than they are on the road. That's been the case for the last several seasons. They open at Columbus against number 8 Ohio State. And if you win that, then your prize is you get to face 13-0 Oregon, and you might have Texas waiting for you in the semifinals should you make it that far. So as you look at these 3 teams from the SEC in the bracket, knowing the uncertainty with Beck, knowing the avenue for each team, how would you rank sort of best chance to least chance of these 3 SEC teams to win the whole prize, the gold medal?
Georgia, Texas, Tennessee. Seems pretty simple to me. I mean,
you're not giving much pause to if you know Beck's out and Stockton's in, that doesn't change your.
You know what? As up and down as Beck has been this year, I'm not convinced Georgia's all that much worse off if he doesn't play.
Fair point.
I mean, he's had a rough go. This has not been 2023 Carson Beck. I think it's I think they can get by with Stockton. I think they handle the Indiana Notre Dame winner, and obviously they're getting a week off, so their path to the semifinal is even easier than Texas's because of the bye. So, and they beat Texas head-to-head twice, including pretty decisively in the regular season. I like Georgia, then Texas, then Tennessee. I separate Texas and Tennessee more on matchups, right?
Yeah.
Because as you point out, Texas, we just talked about Texas having a pretty fortunate path in the regular season with who they played in the SEC. And by the way, they're going to get it again next year because next year it's the same schedule. They're just flipping home and away. But yeah, they've got a Clemson team they ought to be able to handle out of the gate. They got an Arizona State team I think they ought to be able to handle following that. Much better chance. Look, if Texas and Tennessee played head-to-head on a neutral field, to me, that's a coin toss. But because of the matchups, I like Texas's chance to make that run better than Tennessee. Texas has a much better chance of beating Clemson and Arizona State back-to-back than Tennessee has of beating Ohio State and Oregon back-to-back.
Totally agree. It's interesting. I was working on a column this week for USAtoday.com where I was ranking 12-1 the team's chances to win the national championship. So having this exact conversation, but expanding it to every team in the bracket. And it's interesting how much, and you don't want to overdo it, but you can't ignore it either, how much your path, your draw in the bracket kind of influences your choices. Because like as I viewed Ohio State, like, I'm not totally scared off by the whole Ryan Day narrative, can't win the big one. You can't beat Michigan, but last time I looked, Michigan's not in this bracket. And when we have the conversation about, well, who has won the big one, there's only 2 coaches in this bracket that have won a national championship, and I don't think Dabo is winning it. So that leaves Kirby Smart, right? And so I'm not necessarily scared off with that when it comes to Ohio State, and I do think they have great talent, all this stuff. But where I start to move like Ohio State down my list as I look like the whole field is that same path we're talking about for Tennessee. That's Ohio State's path as well, except they get to open at home versus Tennessee going on the road. So it's that much easier, but not a lot, right? And so it is interesting how much sort of that path to Atlanta kind of affects how I assess teams being able to win the national championship. Like if Oregon would have got a little bit of a better draw, I might feel more strongly as labeling them the front runner to win the whole thing. But I don't like their draw. I mean, the fact that they're going to have to play Oregon or Ohio State or Tennessee in the quarterfinals.
Right.
There's other teams I'd rather face in the quarterfinals. So I'm wondering, Chase, in some past 4-year playoffs, I think there were a lot of years where if you gave me the option to either pick one team or take the field and let you pick that one team, I want the one team, and I'll give you the other 3 in the field in the 4-team format. I take my chances. In the 12-team format, obviously the equation differs, right? So I'll start here. If I gave you one team versus the field, A, who would you take in this entire bracket as your one team? And B, if I gave you that offer, would you want that team or would you rather have the other 11?
No. If you want the field, I want 3 teams.
Yeah, okay. Okay. That's the trade-off?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know if I'd do that. Yeah. I'll give you 2 and I'll take 10. That's probably what I'd draw.
Yeah, I mean, I think Oregon's got a hell of a team. I think they got a lot of speed on defense. To me, I think Oregon's probably your overall favorite, especially with the Beck situation, notwithstanding the fact that, like I just said, they might be just as well with Stockton anyway. But would I take Oregon against the field? No way. No way. To me, I see a lot of flawed teams. I don't just think it's flawed at 11, 12, 13, and 14, which is where we kind of kicked off our conversation here today. I think it's flawed almost top to bottom. I mean, Georgia at times, their offense has really struggled. Ohio State with that $20 million roster. I'm not the biggest Will Howard fan. I'll be honest with you. Right. I think he's a Jag, just a guy. And that's the most important position on the field. So I don't know. I think Penn State's beatable. Notre Dame. Texas is beatable. I don't know. I don't see any of these teams that are just a total flex. Like, come get me. I don't see it.
I totally agree, and I think there's a couple factors that we can talk about: NIL, transfers, parity, all that. That all factors in to a certain extent. But to me, just in terms of like personnel X's and O's, I think there's 2 things that jump out to me. What quarterback in this bracket like terrifies you? Like Dylan Gabriel's pretty good, right? I mean, I guess he would be the first one I would take. He's really good, but like I'm just thinking about past years where you had a Joe Burrow in the bracket, or it wasn't just a quarterback, but you had that blur of an Alabama offense with the 2020 tie. Right. Like so that's is that I don't see a quarterback in here that's like, well, that guy's going to ruin my day undeniably. Gabriel's pretty good, but so that's one thing that jumps out to me. I love the running backs in this playoff: Ashton Genty, Cam Scatabo, Dylan Sampson from Tennessee. Great playoff for running backs. Not the best playoff I've ever seen for quarterbacks. So that's 1. And 2, I don't see that super defense that we've seen at different points of the 4-team playoff era, whether that be, one of Nick Saban's best teams with the defenses they had, or with Kirby Smart's back-to-back teams. I mean, like the Georgia defense is kind of hit and miss at times, a little bit Jekyll and Hyde. Tennessee's defense is pretty good, but they didn't get it done when they played Georgia. Ohio State, pretty good defense. I don't think it's the best defense they've had. Texas's defense, pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of pretty good defenses, but I don't see that juggernaut unit that you can just say they're going to put the team on the back and we'll win this thing, just with our defense.
I agree with it. I see a lot of parity here, and I do think NIL's got something to do with it. I'm not necessarily in the camp that says that NIL is gonna flatten out the whole landscape like some people think, but I do see more parity here than, and part of it is you open it up to 12. Look, if it had been a 12-team playoff last year, that might have looked like more parity too. You know, it's a different perspective now looking at 12 instead of 4. But yeah, I'm not going to be surprised if anyone in the top half of the seedings wins the whole thing. It won't shock me.
Yeah. All right. Well, you can find all of Chase's coverage about Alabama's snub, about the fallout of that, over at TuscaloosaNews.com. Chase does a fantastic job covering the Tide. You're at no shortage of options for Alabama coverage, but you also won't find better commentary on Alabama football than you can find from Chase over at TuscaloosaNews.com. And we always appreciate when Chase pops on to join us here on SEC Football Unfiltered. Thanks for checking in with us, Chase.
Enjoyed it, Blake.
All right. Well, thanks for stopping by, listening to us on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered. We'll be back with you next week as we set the stage for first round matchups.